Well, g'day, welcome to our Lena Valley campus, and I'm wanting to take a moment, or a few moments honestly, to share the strategy we are wanting to step into as we move together into the future. The purpose of this video is to allow small groups particularly, but anyone associated with the church to glimpse a bit of our heart and hear from me and from our leadership team where we see things going as we then prepare for our vision forums and our church meeting, where we'll together have a chance to input on the vision and direction for the church. We as a church family have been on a journey for the last 3 years. You may remember when I first arrived, I arrived at a pretty interesting moment in the life of the church. We were coming up to the 40th anniversary for Citywide Baptist Church, the 70th Citywide Baptist Church at Mornington rather, the 70th anniversary for our Lena Valley campus, and the 10th anniversary for the birth of Citywide Baptist Church as Lena Valley and Mornington came together, and then later on the Nepalese congregation joined us to be 3 congregations. As I stand with you now, we are in dialogue with a new congregation out at Levendale who look like they're going to also be joining the Citywide family, and I'm looking forward to telling you more about that. But as we took that journey of looking at those anniversaries, very clearly our intent was to say, God, what have you been doing in the life of the Lena Valley campus, the Mornington campus, the Nepalese congregation, and in this city over these years? Who are you calling us to be? What have we been when we've been at our best? As we try to encapsulate that journey and name who our church has been when we've been at our best and what God is calling us to be, we came up with a fairly simple sentence that encapsulated that, and that was, we follow Jesus. That at the heart of our church, we are a bunch of people who follow Jesus into the adventure of whole life and authentic community. If you want to know who Citywide is, we are a mob who prioritise following Jesus, and we have a sense that he is leading us into the adventure of whole life and also being an authentic community. We unpack that with these banners that you'll see at both campuses, starting with the follow banner. And you'll see where it says, we follow Jesus and reflect his hope in the places where we live, learn, work and play. And for us, that's central. There's almost nothing else that matters. Jesus is the Lord of our church. We want him to be the actual head of our church, not just the figurehead of our church. And on these banners too, you'll notice we name the kinds of behaviour we think we need to build into our lives for that to be true. So following Jesus is the centre of all we're about. But we know it's not that following Jesus needs to work itself out in other ways, and in 2 ways in particular. We know, and we've been talking about this past year, that each one of us has to step into our own unique story that is reflected in what it means to be a blessing to the world. And so what we say is each of us is growing in integrity and maturity on the unique adventure of whole life to which we're called. We're all called to a unique adventure, to be a blessing to the world. And the way you are called is different to the way I am called, and the purpose of our church is to help you find and fulfill the story that God has for you. And that has been true right the way through the history of our church. Also, we know that we are called not to do this journey alone. We want to share as an authentic community where nobody stands alone on the journey of life. So these 3 statements that are on these banners are kind of aspirational. They're the vision we're reaching towards. And for each of the banners, as I've already said, that there are these behaviours we want to build into our life. But for us, as best we can tell, these are our best attempts at naming the overall vision we're heading towards. These are not a strategy. A strategy happens when the vision hits the messy reality of the world we find ourselves in. And that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about how do we actually do this stuff? How does this stuff impact our day-to-day lives, impact our budgets and our choices as a church family? And what is the world we find ourselves in? We need to talk about the world we find ourselves in. Do you feel yourself feeling a little bewildered sometimes at some of the ways things are going and finding it hard to find your bearings? You wouldn't be alone. We live in a unique moment in history. Every so often, a seismic shift happens in society. You may have heard about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happened around 1765, and it represented a shift from an agrarian society where people were kind of craftsmen and would be responsible for the whole production of things, and societies were largely based around villages. And as industry developed and people became themselves seen as resources, parts of machines, and we started talking about human resource management, the whole society started to organise itself around this way of thinking. And one of the great benefits of the Industrial Revolution was we were able to produce huge amounts of product in very sustainable ways. We are in an Industrial Revolution kind of moment. From 1765, there was a trajectory that was set right the way through till the late 20th century. From about the year 2000 onwards, we entered a new era. And have you noticed, it feels like change has sped up. Can you believe the World Wide Web itself was only invented in 1989? That things like the iPad was only invented in 2002. Things that are so, normal for us, like Facebook was only invented in 2004, and Zoom, this thing that we have lived the last few months on, was only invented in 2011. These technology platforms are not the sole reason for some of the seismic change, but they are symbolic of it. So let's have a talk about what this networked world we're living in means at the moment. In this networked world, most of us find ourselves responsible for promoting ourselves. Rather than being part of a big organisation that tells us what our career path should be, or part of a church that charts our life course for us, most of us find ourselves responsible for promoting ourselves. And some people spend a lot of time on Facebook or Instagram or social media trying to portray an image of themselves. This is part of the reality we find ourselves in. At the same time as each one of us is responsible for promoting and steering our own path, increasingly, more and more of us are working alone. More and more of us are finding through bits and pieces of work, whether it's through apps like Uber, where people can, do piecework, or even in organisations where work now increasingly gets farmed out, we're finding ourselves working alone. And this trend and many of the trends that are part of our network reality have been, it's like turbocharged by COVID-19. And it's like COVID-19, a number of sociologists are saying it's like it's sped us up by a decade or so in terms of heading towards the kind of world we find ourselves stepping into at the moment. Another part of the moving away from the industrial era of organising ourselves and moving into this networked era is that there is a fundamental loss of trust in organisations, authority structures, and the big stories that used to give life meaning. So we don't trust ourselves to an organisation anymore. There was a day when you would get employed as a 15-year-old in the organisation and you would retire in that same organisation 50 or 60 years later. No longer. We don't trust ourselves to organisations. We don't trust ourselves to politicians. And the stories that would give life meaning, like Christianity, are no longer trusted in the same way. What is trusted in our networked world is our own understanding of what is true. And so people are left talking about their truth, their reality, and probably the greatest sin in our increasingly networked world is not being true to yourself, which from a biblical understanding, we understand to be a dangerous thing because there's more than one side to us. And so truth is subjective in this networked world. Another major shift in this networked world is that where there was I don't know if you picked up, there's not a really healthy TV series, but an interesting TV series called Mad Men that talked about the advertising industry. And whereas the advertising used to be a broad thing that targeted major demographics, now marketers can have extensive information about you and market specifically to you on the basis of psychological research. While at the same time we're trusting big organisations less and less, those big organisations have learnt how to target you in ways that other generations previously couldn't have imagined. And increasingly, we're all living in our own realities as we find ourselves in the recipients of messages that are unique to us. Increasingly, mass media, the voices we used to trust on the nightly news, is being consumed less and less, and media is being more and more personally specific. Another shift, as part of a result of all of this, is that loneliness is becoming an epidemic. At the same time, we're more connected than ever. More and more of us are suffering from things like depression and anxiety, and more of us are feeling socially isolated. One of the realities of this networked world is that those who have more connections, it's a general rule of networks, those who have more connections will do better than those who have less connections. And there's all kinds of research to show that the more connections you have, the more money you have, the healthier you will be, the better education you will get. That in this networked world, wealth is not so much about dollars and cents, but about connections. And finally, while in this networked world, communication is easier than ever before, there are so many voices out there, and communication about good things is just as easy or maybe even less easy than communication about stuff that's unhelpful. And really the major way communication happens is through emotion. And so the way you get shared or communication happens most effectively is if it produces an emotional response in us. And it is far easier to provoke negative emotions than to provoke positive emotions. So we see that on our commercial television stations, they find it easier to put on shows that provoke unhealthy emotions. We see in social media, it's far easier to get likes and to get response to provoke unhealthy emotions. And so at a time where the church is more able than ever before to communicate the message of Jesus Christ, we find ourselves awash with all kinds of messages, and often we're not so equipped to communicate the message in this landscape. These are just some of the realities we now find ourselves in. These were not realities in the same way 20 years ago. We are, as we're saying, going through this seismic shift. And we need to work out if what we were saying on those banners is true, what kind of church do we need to be in this networked reality? We want to suggest that there are three particular things that need to be true for us in our strategy as we move forward. The first is this, that we need to be the kind of church that doesn't just reflect this networked reality, and we need to be the kind of church that prepares our people not just to be shaped by this networked reality, but we want to be the kind of church where we are encouraging you as an individual, and each one of our people to take next steps, whatever the next steps might be for you. And as it will be different for each one of us, but for each one of us to continually taking next steps in making Jesus the primary focus of our lives. For us, we take Colossians 2, 6 and 7 pretty seriously, where in Colossians it says, just as you receive Christ Jesus as Lord, continue to live out your lives in Him, rooted and built up in Him, strengthened in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. We want to not just make an intellectual one-off assent to who Jesus is, but we want to continue to live our lives in Him and be the kind of church that encourages you to take a next step today. That each day you'll be taking a next step in taking Jesus more seriously in your life. That's the first major thrust in our strategy. The second major thrust in our strategy is in this world where loneliness is increasingly a problem. We need to be active in building genuine community. We want to facilitate opportunities for authentic relationship among our people and between our people and those who don't yet know Jesus. Jesus tells us that he has a new command for us, that we are to love each other as He's loved us, and that will be one of the major ways that the world will know. So we need to think in new ways. This world, the networked reality we find ourselves in, will lead us to social isolation. So we need to act in ways that are not normal, but build towards actual community. And the final strategy we want to suggest in this world, we're going to want to talk more about what all this means. But the final strategy is we need to help you, find the unique purpose that God has for your life and to step into it day by day. We want to provide training and provide support so that you can be free to step into the unique story that God has for you. We understand from Ephesians 4, 11 to 13 that this is Jesus' heart for the church, that we need to think in new ways. And look, this will be a scary thing for us to be doing as we step into the church in new ways. But we want to suggest that we are, as a church, needing to step into transitioning from one way of organising ourselves to a new way of organising ourselves that better maps to these strategies.